Hi. So something happened in America about a year ago, early May into early June of last year, that I thought was really interesting, and I think a lot of other people thought it was interesting too, and I wanted to talk more about it. So the first thing that happened is on May 4th, 2016, Donald Trump becomes the Republican nominee for President of the United States. Now a month later, on June 9th, Hillary Clinton does the same thing on the other side. She becomes a Democratic nominee for the President of the United States. Now, I don't have to describe to you what a divisive, fiery, fast-paced campaign we saw. I mean, it was one of the most divisive campaigns in history. But the thing that I really want to focus on that I thought was so interesting was how as soon as the pleasantries of the two, the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention, as soon as those pleasantries were over, people just dug into one side and chose a candidate they liked. So if you liked Hillary, you saw Trump supporters as these crazy people hell-bent on the destruction of America as we know it. And if you're a Trump supporter, you saw Hillary supporters as these people who were willing to deal with corruption, who saw this evil woman and were just okay with it. So people really started to get mad at, not just at the candidates, but at each other. So as the debates kept going, we kept hearing ridiculous things, and with every tweet, every news story that came out, we started to think, oh, that's it, Hillary's done. That's it, Trump's done. Well, it didn't happen, ever. But all of us had this sort of suspicion in the back of our head that on November 8th and November 9th, with Election Day, it'll all be over, a victor will be crowned, we'll have a new president, and we can all go back to living our lives normally. That was true for some of us. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, they were able to mend their relationship. You know, Hillary was able to call Donald and say, well done, great campaign, don't screw this up. But that's not the reality for most of us. We saw on election night just what a divided nation we really live in. Now, we knew states were going to go red, we knew states were going to go blue, we knew there were some states that were more or less a toss-up. But what we didn't realize was how the demographic would break down. We didn't realize how overwhelmingly all of the votes that Hillary Clinton got would come from overwhelming percentages of minority groups, blacks, Hispanics, lots of women. We didn't realize that the white vote would lean so far in favor of Donald Trump. We knew that whites tended to vote for Republicans and that it might favor Donald Trump, but we didn't realize just how much it would favor Donald Trump. So, upon looking at these exit polls, which were perhaps the most shocking of Election Day, CNN analyst Van Jones made a controversial comment that some of you might remember. He called the result of this election whitelash. Now, the comment wasn't very well received, and plenty of people were upset about that, saying, well, it's not just a race thing. And he did acknowledge that, and he later went on The View, and he kind of talked about it more and said, I didn't mean to blame all the problems of the world on white people. But what a lot of people are upset about, I thought was a really interesting point. See, as a person of mixed race, I kind of understand what Trump is all about, what Hillary is all about, and I kind of understand what Van Jones is trying to say in there. So this divide in America that I like to talk about, this political and racial polarization, which really interested me and is the focus of this project, it's something that I think I see a microcosm of in my family. So, to be fair, my family does not exist on such a wide political spectrum as the United States of America. We are all, for the most part, college-educated liberals, the only exception being me, because I haven't gone to college yet. But, so we're all pretty much in the same place on the left. However, the difference that I do see, and it is a minute difference, is that my white family, they have one ideology and they have a belief system which leads them to certain candidates supporting certain policies. And my black family, they have almost completely different ideologies that lead them to supporting pretty much the same candidates, policies, reforms. So what I'm saying in short is they have different ideas, but they're voting for the same thing. So I really wanted to get to the bottom of this. Why is there this disparity? Why do people think so differently just because of their race? And I mean, you can't simply say that the color of a person's skin determines how they think, because that gets into, the racism, scientific racism, and that's something that we as a society are better than, I think. And so I really wanted to see, this small divide in my family. How does that divide become this massive canyon of divide? And how do we get these 2, 3, 4 separate nations that see things in totally different ways living in our United States of America? So there are some simple solutions for this. Um, why are so many minorities in favor of Democrats? Why are so many whites in favor of Republicans? And why are they so different? One popular theory is that minorities minorities are very poor, typically because they haven't been in the country for very long, or because they were in the country for a while, but slavery and legal inequality bogged them down. They haven't had as much time to accumulate wealth. And so, because they haven't accumulated that wealth, they tend to be less well off than white people. And so they support candidates who will, push for more welfare programs, more social safety net programs, and they find that in the Democrats. And the obvious other side of that is the white people who have been in this country for several generations, who have had time in their families to accumulate wealth, whether it be through marriage, through labor, through whatever it is. And since they have accumulated that wealth, they want to hold on to it. And so they don't really need these social safety nets. They're not as important to them. They'd rather secure their wealth and keep their wealth for generations to come. And that's why they go to the Republicans, who favor a more laissez-faire type of government. I think that's a very interesting theory, and it does make a lot of sense. The only issue that I take with it is it's not entirely true. If you look, there are plenty of African Americans, Hispanics, gays, lesbians, bisexual, transsexual. There are plenty of people who are not, white males who've done very well for themselves and whose families have done very well for years now. And they still vote for Democrats, despite being, very well off. And if you look at a lot of Southern voters, specifically in the South, a lot of them are extremely poor, living in the boondocks, and yet they still vote for Republicans against these sort of social safety net features. So the simple way to put it would just be people are dumb. They'll vote against their own self-interest because that's just what people do. They make bad decisions unless you force them to do things. But I really don't think that's true. I really want to get to the bottom of this. So when looking at this, I decided I wanted to get a little bit historical with it. I wanted to see, when does this really start? When does this racial and political polarization begin in the country? And to look at that, perhaps the best time period to look at is about 50, 60 years ago, looking at the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in 1964. Now, there are obvious political differences, really throughout history, from before America was even a thing. But to analyze this current racial and political divide, we really have to look at the last turning point in our nation's political landscape, and that was the Civil Rights Movement. So, from the end of the era of Reconstruction to sort of the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, race was not such a hot-button issue. You had things like World War I, a Great Depression, World War II, you had the emergence of progressivism. These are all things that kind of distract the public mind from racism, even though the United States is going through this horrible period of racism where people are being lynched, people are being dragged out of their homes. Jim Crow laws are prevalent in many southern states, even some northern states. But somehow race was still not an issue. That's until the 1950s and the 1960s, when African Americans and plenty of white folks who sympathized with them, they decided to get vocal with it and say, hey, this isn't right. We need to fix something. We need to change something in our government fundamentally. And so one of the hugest turning points, of course, is the Civil Rights Act. And I want to show you how the Senate voted on the Civil Rights Act. Now, all these dark blue seats here, they represent Democrats who voted yes for this bill. And all these dark red seats over here, those are all Republicans that voted yes for it. Now, in here, you can't really see it, but there's some faint blue and there's some faint red. Those represent both Democrats and Republicans that vote no on this. So it's important to understand that there wasn't, this strict divide of the Republicans were the racist party, the Democrats were the liberators, they were the great equalizers. Although the Democrats were the large carrying force in passing this bill through the Senate, you get a lot of these light blue, which represent Democrats who said nay, and those are sort of the Dixiecrats, these Southern Democrats who had this racism, although they were progressives and they identified as Democrats. And then you have some Southern Republicans, actually less Republicans voted no than Democrats voted no, who also had this sort of racist mindset that black people were still not, fully equal to white people in society. So it's important to understand that while there isn't this massive divide, African Americans and minority groups, they see that Democrats are the biggest passing body. The Democrats have all the votes that the bill needs to get to the president, to be signed by the president into law. And so, of course, it's black people, minorities, they see that the Democrats are really fighting in Washington. They're trying to make a difference. They want to equalize the playing field. And black people become solid Democratic voters. And this is a trend that we still see today. As I just referenced in our election in 2016, black people voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton. Hispanic people voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton. And while many of the people who voted in this election may not have been around during the civil rights era, may have been too young to remember it, there is sort of a familial passing down of politics that we have all experienced, that generally a child's politics tend to be the same as their parents. And so, the young African American, Hispanic people during this time period, they most likely passed down that we are strong, that feeling of we are strong Democrats, we will always be in favor of Democrats, down to their children, who pass it down to their children, maybe even pass it down to their children, and are now young people in today's society. So this really makes perfect sense when discussing another TED Talk by Rob Weiler. So Rob Weiler has this TED Talk, and he talks about fixing our political discussions. And he theorizes that we are not fundamentally attached to our political beliefs. You know, a Republican would not go out and die for low taxation. A Democrat would not go out and die in the name of increasing environmental regulations. Those are simply things that we tether to because we think they're right, but we wouldn't go out, fight a war, and die for them. However, what Weiler states we are connected to are our moral beliefs. So moral beliefs in equality, respect for your elders, civic virtue. These are all things that are part of who we are fundamentally. And while they can be changed, yes, they are practically impossible to change because they're just so deeply rooted in who we are. Rob Weiler says, if you play a political position into someone's moral values, so you take a moral that they find very important, that they emphasize this moral in their day-to-day life, and you explain your political position in a way that kind of targets that moral, they're much more likely to agree with you and say, yeah, that is something that I think is right. That's a policy that I will support. And so wouldn't it just make sense that if morals are a part of who you are and you base your political positions on who you are, wouldn't it also make sense that race is a major determining factor in your positions? So if you're an African American voter in 1965 going to the ballot box for whatever election there may have been, and you know that the Democrats are fighting for you in Washington, or you feel that way, and you know that it was the Democrats who passed this bill that became an act, and it became a law, and it's now, the law of the land, you're much more likely to say, you know what, I agree with this position of progressivism. I agree we need environmental regulations, because these are all things that the Democrats are talking about, and whether or not you really care about it, it's coming from someone who is supporting who you fundamentally are, who is playing to your fundamental existence. So you're much more likely to follow their path, to do what they say. And so the same thing goes for a white voter, a white Southern voter who feels like these Democrats, especially the Southern Democrats, have turned their backs on us. They are advancing these African Americans, and these people fundamentally did not believe that, African Americans were equal. However foolish that may be, this is how they felt. And so they're going to say, well, the Republicans are watching out for us. The Republicans are watching out for the white man. So, yeah, I believe in laissez-faire government because these Republicans believe in laissez-faire government, and they're fighting for me. So they must be right. And that's a feeling that we all kind of have as humans, that we all want to agree with our protectors. And when we see our protectors, we just assume that everything they do has to be right. Everything they do is good-natured because they're protecting us. They're stronger than us. It's the same way that you always believe that your mother and your father are good people. You may grow up one day and find out that, they were horrible people, that they were rude to their friends, they were bad neighbors, but when you're a child, you still want to fundamentally believe, and even as an adult, you still want to fundamentally believe that because these people are your protectors, or were your protectors, they're good. They're going to do what is good for you. So, moving forward with this sort of historical claim, this historical idea that African Americans kind of latched onto Democrats after the Democrats helped them gain equality in society. That is very much still the case. It can be argued at great length whether or not African Americans are completely equal in today's society. You could argue that by law, yes, they are, but in practicality, it doesn't work out that way. You could argue that by law, no, they are not. They are not equal. You could also argue that by law and in practicality, they are equal. It is equal. This is something that is purely subjective, and I really don't have the time or the willpower to get into this argument because it is so unique to who we fundamentally are that my fundamental belief is not necessarily going to shift your fundamental belief because, as I said, it is partially attached to your morals. So this sense of loyalty that black voters have had has kind of continued, and that black people are saying, the Democrats are fighting for us, and now that there are more minority groups represented in the country, immigrant groups, they're able to say that the Democrats are in Washington fighting for us, and that works today. That is perfectly reasonable. What is no longer reasonable is the old Southern ideology that the Republicans are in Congress fighting for the white man because the white man is superior to the black man, to the brown man, to the yellow man, to the purple man, to the red man, whatever it may be. That ideology of superiority is no longer acceptable in our society. So the ideology has to change a little bit. And there's a really interesting change that's been made in the ideology that I want to talk about. And this is how we're sort of getting to the modern era of conservatism, of being a Republican, and sort of entering this now Trump era of politics. So Alan I. Abramowitz, he writes this article back in 2004. And the reason he writes it is because a certain section of the Civil Rights Act, Section 5, is up for renewal. And it has to be renewed every 25 years. So 25 years after 1964, that's 89, it was renewed. And then in 2004, it comes up as a debate again. And the reason it's being debated and not being universally accepted is because this particular act made it law that 11 specific states would have to go through federal approval before they made any change whatsoever to their electoral process. Now, initially this law was put in place because there was fear that in these states there was some amount of racism that would result in voter suppression because white people and white politicians did not want minorities to vote. Now, I truly believe this is not the case anymore. It is not that white people and white politicians do not want black people to vote, Hispanic people to vote, Arab people to vote because they don't like them. However, they may not want them to vote because it is politically disadvantageous to them. So, what Alan Abramowitz is talking about in his article is essentially, yes, this racism is gone. There is no longer racism in these states necessarily, whether it's overt or not. There's no huge amount of racism in these states. However, we still need to protect these minority voters because there is still political advantage to suppressing them. And that's where we get into sort of the modern tensions that we feel between race and between parties. So, a white politician in North Carolina knows there's a significant advantage that if he is a Republican, and white people tend to vote Republican, he knows that if the majority of the people who come out and vote on election day are white voters, there's a very good chance he will either get put into office or he will get reelected. Now, this has actually become kind of a controversy in North Carolina because there was, an attempted redrawing of districts by Republican lawmakers, state legislators, which was actually struck down by a federal court on the basis that it was racially separating these districts. Now, one of the state congressmen, he went in front of the floor and he was very specific saying, this is not an act of racism. We are simply trying to divide up the state so it is more politically advantageous for us Republicans. Now think about that. This is exactly what Alan Abramowitz is talking about in his article. Though these lawmakers are not necessarily racist, they don't hate black people, Hispanic people, they don't want them not to be a part of our society, they do not want them to be involved at the ballot box because they know that means almost certainly that they will be in trouble on election day. Now this sort of feeds into the idea of race relations growing tense, the sort of racial polarization and the political polarization, because most people don't look at this so deep. Most people look at it at the surface level, and they say these are white politicians in North Carolina who don't want black people to vote, who don't want Hispanics to vote, who don't want Arabs to vote, who don't want non-whites to vote in general. While it may or may not be the truth, minority groups see this, and it becomes a source of great contention, because this is being presented to them as, this white person doesn't want you to vote because of the color of your skin. Then, once this gets into the news cycle and more politicians get a hold of this and politicians argue over this, it becomes a political issue, because they're not looking at why they're dividing them by race. They're not looking at the voter trends. They simply see politicians who are trying to divide people up by race, trying to get people of different races not to vote. It becomes a political issue, because now it's the Republicans are doing this, while the Democrats are doing that, while the Republicans are doing this. And there's so much shouting back and forth that really the deep, in-depth truth gets lost, and it becomes a major issue. So this is the issue we have now, where we have people of different races who think that, white people are trying to actively work against minorities. There are white people who believe that minorities are actively trying to work against them. Republicans are hating Democrats. Democrats hate Republicans. And all that results in this toxic political atmosphere that none of us can live in, and is not healthy for us as a society. And the major problem with this is, now we're in the 21st century, and social media has become a major factor in everyday life. So what that means is, if you have maybe one or two positions that you feel strongly about, like you are very strongly pro-choice, and you believe in welfare programs, that solidly classifies you as a Democrat. Now, maybe you don't really care about the environment so much, or environmental regulations aren't so important to you. But because you have these 2 or 3 policy beliefs that qualify you to be a Democrat, you join the Democratic Party. Then you get emails, you follow people on social media, your congressman is writing you emails, and more and more and more you're hearing about the environment. And all of a sudden, this issue that wasn't important to you before, environmental regulations, becomes extremely important. And whereas a month or 2 ago you couldn't have cared less about the environment, now you feel very, very strongly that we need to place more regulations on industry to protect the environment. The same thing goes for Republicans. Maybe you believe in laissez-faire government, and you believe in, you believe that life is sacred and that abortion should not be allowed in our country. These are 2 very strong beliefs that you have, and everything else is kind of wishy-washy. So you join the Republican Party because you share these 2 beliefs in common. And now, all of a sudden, you're being hit with the same level of social media influence, email influence, letters from your congressmen, letters from your senators, and all of a sudden you have a slew of new political beliefs that you believe very, very strongly in, because a lot of very persuasive people have penetrated your social sphere. So this is the major problem that we have now. People have basically picked a side, and they're not budging at all. That's what we saw in this election, and that's why things got so contentious. So perhaps the best way to illustrate this is looking at how many voters have mixed political opinions to solid left or solid right political opinions. If you look at a chart in 1980, you'd see a good solid amount of people with completely left-leaning opinions, a good solid amount of people with solidly right-leaning opinions, but the vast majority of people sit in the middle and make it look like a bell curve, because the vast majority of people had mixed political views. If you fast forward now, 36 years later, 37 years later, 2016 and 2017, you look at that same graph, and it's gone from being a pretty tall hill to a very steep valley, where almost everyone has gone completely to the left or completely to the right. So this is the problem that I think we have. And this is, I think, the result of the political and racial polarization that I hope I've displayed for you today. You have Republicans who come out and they say, yeah, I'm a Republican, but no, I don't hate the LGBT community. No, I don't really think that life is all that precious. If you get raped, if something happens, you should be able to terminate a pregnancy. And the rest of us think, why are you a Republican? Those have been major positions over the past 20 years. Same thing on the other side. You look at a Democrat, someone comes out and says, yeah, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not a crybaby. I don't think poor people should just get money handed to them. I don't cry about everything. I'm not a social justice warrior. And you think, well, then why is your party, propagating so many of these people? Why are these people the face of your party? This is the major issue that we have in our country. It's been said too much that, voting for a third-party candidate is just throwing away your vote, because it's always going to be a Democrat or a Republican that wins the election. I'd like to challenge that. I think the only way we can fix our broken political system, the only way we can start to mend our racial tensions, the only way we can start to mend our political tensions, are by going out, looking up and down the ballot every single election day, and deciding, this is the candidate who I believe in. Now, this isn't to say that you'll always find someone who is perfect and shares your exact political ideology. In fact, in a nation of 308 million plus people, odds are you're going to get one person at the top, the president, who does not exactly share your political views. But as you get closer and closer and closer to the local level, you should find politicians who increasingly share political views with you. Now, this is definitely somewhat counterintuitive. We live in a pretty competitive culture, and the fact that we have sort of a two-team political system is not good, because it makes everything very competitive. If you look at countries like England, Germany, Finland, they'll have multiple political parties, 8, 10, 11 political parties, basically going all the way from the way, way, way far left, all the way to the way, way, way far right. And, you could argue that those nations are just as well off as the United States, maybe a little worse well off than the United States. But one thing that they're doing so much better than us at is not being so mad at each other all the time. So if there's one thing that you can take away from this, there's one thing that I want you to understand about racial and political polarization. It's that you have to go out and be active. You can't just sit around and vote for whoever you think is going to win the election, whoever you think has the best odds of doing a decent job, whoever's just going to keep America afloat for another 4 years. You have to go out and you have to pick the candidate that really fits who you are as a person, racially, politically, morally. You cannot settle. You have to be the change you want to see in the world. Thank you very much.